My name is Steve. I want to welcome you to the monthly meeting of our Dade chapter of the Florida Native Plant Society. I hope everyone is enjoying our hurricane-free summers, because it's not summer anymore, right? So it's fall. For those of you who are new and enjoyed tonight's meeting, please consider joining our not-for-profit organization, which promotes the conservation and use of native plants. And you can join. Jim, do we have forms to fill out in the back still, the brochures? For members? Oh, Jeannie's got them. Okay. Yeah, as Patty says, if you can, join online with a credit card, I guess. It's cheap. I think it's 35 bucks. It's been 35 bucks for 20 years. So that, I mean, 20 years ago, 35 bucks today, it's probably like $15, right? So, but if you could also sign up, there's a clipboard in the back for a free Tillandsia. That's our newsletter. Is there not one? Okay, never mind. I want to thank, tonight we brought back some refreshments since the virus. And Karina and Serge Gomez were able to provide that for us. And of course, the Dade chapter has sponsored it. But Karina's done a fantastic job. The coffee pot is actually the chapter's. And she found that for less than 30 bucks. So we'll have coffee. And the coffee is decaffeinated. So you'll have to bring your own caffeine. There's also snacks and stuff back there. And there's a tip jar. Thank you to all the plant raffle donors, which you see quite the spread tonight, which we'll go over before the meeting. And you can buy raffle tickets from Jen in the back. Are you helping us sell raffle tickets? Karina is? How much are they? I can't even remember. So 2 for $1, and then 12 for $5. Is that right? And that's good coffee. Of course, many of these are donated by our new online plant store folks, and 2 of them are here today. We have Raul sitting down, and where'd Giselle go? Raise your hand. Here you are. So they're now growing plants, which we sell on our online store, and many of them are here. And of course, the raffle plants is always one of the best places to get plants for your yard, because you'll find stuff there that you won't find at a lot of native nurseries. We also have in the back items for sale. We have some books and some gloves. You know, it's nice to be outside. It's going to get cool, so they tell me. And you need a good pair of gloves if you're weeding, right? And I think they're $5. They're really good gloves, and you could throw them in the laundry. The other thing that we have, Jim brought in, for you old timers, you may remember there was a county magazine called Tropical Trails. And he brought some in. Jeannie's holding them up. Those are free. You can take those home and, go back to the 70s and 80s and reminisce. Okay. I just want to announce a couple things. Next month, our program will be the Underlines Green Corridor, Connecting Humans, Habitat, and Wildlife by Asha Bersh, who's a horticulturalist at the Underline, which is the garden that's underneath the Metro Rail. The next field trip is this weekend, September 29th, and it will be at the Gifford Arboretum at the University of Miami. And you all will be visiting some plots dedicated to particular orders or families. That's generally how arboretums are arranged. It's like a living museum of plants or a zoo for plants. And there are tropical and subtropical trees from around the world or species from around the world. And you'll see familial similarity to some natives and non-natives. So you'll get to learn a little bit about plant taxonomy. And I think our speaker will be help leading that trip. And then, Patty, is there a work day in October? So I know there are a couple of people that might be interested in volunteering. If you like to get your hands dirty, but you don't get dirty? Well, why? How's that a work day? Oh, well, your gloves get dirty. All right. Okay. All right. Well, anyway, see Patty Ferris if you wish to help out and weed the visitor center outside of Everglades National Park's main visitor center. And it's a great time of year to be out there because there's a lot of cool stuff that blooms in October.
But if you're a member, you'll get the information.
She said, if you're a member, all the information's in the newsletter, so you don't have to bug her, I think is what she meant. Native Plant Day will be at Castillo Hammock Park next year, and put it on your calendars. The new date time is March 22nd. Okay. Someone also asked me to announce that next weekend, is it Saturday? There's a this coming Saturday. So this is this Saturday. North Miami Public Library, which is at Northeast 8th Avenue and 132nd Street, is having a plant expo from 10 to 2. It's an opportunity to learn from master gardeners and other experts, especially for those of you who live up in the north part of the county. It should be a great opportunity. We're entering the time of lots of events. Are there any other announcements? March 22nd, 2025. Any other announcements? We should announce anything you want to talk about the online store, Raul or Charlie? Yeah, but the sales are hot, so get your plants now. And you got to. They have milkweeds on occasion, but they sell out fast, right? Any cool wildflowers you got coming up? Yeah, that's a nice one. So which species? That's a tuberosa. So we're going to have Asclepias tuberosa, which is host plant for monarchs, and the swamp milkweed, which is the Asclepias incarnata. And then he also mentioned Chamaecrista thuringiana, which is Deering's partridge pea. It's a beautiful pine rockland wildflower. So if you have pine rockland garden, it'd be great for that. Blooms year round. Right? Yes, Carly. When will the milkweed be ready? Soon. Oh, so a month. Okay. A little over a month. So there will be, the availability be limited per customer. You can't buy all of them. Yes. The Kindle campus? Okay. All right. So next Sunday is Dade County's famous Adopt a Tree program, where if you're a citizen with an address in Dade, you can get 2 free trees. So even if you don't have a house, you could take 2 trees and give it to someone. And it's at the Kindle campus between Kindle and Killian, due west of here. Any other announcements? All right. I guess I'll do the raffle descriptions unless someone else wants to. All right. I know this is any native plant enthusiast, this is a fairly pedestrian plant. Everyone probably already has this in their yard. But if you're new, this is a great plant to have in your yard. It's a shiny leaf wild coffee. And what's nice about it is it attracts lots of pollinators. has small white flowers and beautiful red fruit for the most part. There are some forms that'll have an orange or yellow fruit. This grows in our hammock forests, and it'll tolerate a great deal of shade. It also kind of tops out at about 8 feet, so it's not going to get too big if you have a small space. This will spread throughout your yard though. But if you kind of have a chop and drop system, it's great for that. And I can tell you from my experience, because I have chickens, if you feed the fruit to your chickens, which are bright red, the yolks will be red, like lipstick red yolks. There's a few little weeds in here, but there's 2 little seedlings in this little guy here, and this is the state endangered Bahama coffee, which is Psychotria ligustrifolia, whereas the other one that I showed you was Psychotria nervosa. This one's only found in Upper Key Largo and a few sites in Dade County. It's at Larry and Penny, it's at Matheson, and that's about it. It's not in Everglades National Park. So if some of you think that we have this giant preserve and that's enough to protect all the plants, it is not. And some of these smaller preserves are very important for species like this. You'd grow it similarly with the wild coffee. You'd put it kind of on the edge of a hammock, and it's a little bit thirstier than wild coffee, but it's not a wetland plant. Okay. Here we have a quasi-native. This is your classic raffle plant where you have more than one species in this pot. But the larger one in here, this is lyre leaf sage, and this is a native salvia, Salvia lyrata. And it's probably a little bit more native than that coccinia, the tropical sage, which everyone loves because the buntings eat the seeds and the hummingbirds come to the flowers. This will have little purple flowers. This one comes down to about Palm Beach County. So technically, it's not really found in Dade County. But what's nice about this is this one you can grow in your lawn. It's mowable, although you'll take out the inflorescence if you mow it too much. And it'll tolerate a good deal of shade. And there's not a lot of plants, you'll find that native plants, there aren't very many that grow in shade. You also have in here what looks like a Deering partridge pea and a Havana skullcap. So you kind of have a little trio of wildflowers in this pot. All right, well, I'm going to sell this one. So this is a native grass. This is an andropogon of some flavor. It appears to be in the Virginicus series, but I'm not sure. It's very small because most andropogons are tall. The common name for andropogons are sometimes they're called blue stems, but they can also be called broom sedges. Even though it's not a sedge, it's a grass. And grasses, fall is the best time to see grasses flowering. And you can see this one's got little fluffy spikelets or flowers in it. And this is great for a pine rockland planting. And if you ever go out in the pinelands in Dade County, it's all about the grasses, but hardly anyone sells the grasses. You know why no one sells the grasses? Because no one buys the grasses. So we're trying to remedy that somewhat on our online store, but I'm sure for the most part, you probably don't sell out of the grasses. So, shame. Okay. So here we have a wildflower. Looks like it's a Frosia. Doesn't have a label on it. Is this the rare one, the Corlicula? Okay. So this has a great common name that sounds naughty. They're called hoary peas, but it's spelled H-O-A-R-Y, which means like hairy. Okay. So this is a scandent, which means it grows along the ground or prostrate wildflower, and this will fill up your yard. It's Tephrosia corlicula. It's an endemic. It's only found in Dade County and nowhere else in the world, outside of Everglades National Park. The last remnant population I remember finding in the 90s was at Chapman Field in the lawn. And Fairchild had taken this in and propagated it, and we've installed it at a few preserves. So now it's at least protected on preserves, but those are all cultivated plants and their progeny. So the wild population, I don't know if it's extant at Chapman Field. I haven't gone back to check. But this will have pink flowers, and they're papilionoid, which means they're butterfly shaped, and they attract predominantly bees. So not just honeybees, all the little native bees. We have a couple other wildflowers here. This is a young plant of Rudbeckia hirta, which is brown-eyed Susan. This is another one similar to the Salvia lyrata. Comes down to about Palm Beach County. It's also in the Big Cypress in Collier County, but I don't think it was ever historic to date. It may have been at one time in North Dade, where we had some flatwoods that kind of looked like those up in Palm Beach. But what's nice about it, it's a perennial wildflower. It's got yellow ray flowers, which look like petals to the average person. And then the disc flowers in the middle are brown, hence the name brown-eyed Susan. And this would grow in wet flatwoods. It gets to be about that tall, the inflorescence. This is one that used to be in the nursery trade that kind of fell out of the nursery trade down here. And this is in the mint family. This is called blue curls. It's Trichostoma dichotoma. And it's found in coastal strand communities in the back dunes, but it's also found in a few of the pinelands. And it goes up the state a little bit. It has these real pretty blue flowers with these long anthers, and they kind of melt off the plant. These are old flowers, so they're best to see them in the morning. And like most mints, this is another one to attract bees who specialize on most members of the Lamiaceae. The leaves aren't always fragrant, but in a lot of cases, mint families, they'll have fragrant leaves. For those of you who have a water feature, this is a great plant. This is a bandana of the Everglades. It's also called Canna flaccida, which is a native monocot. If you have a water feature, this is great for you. If you don't, you can keep it in a pot in a saucer of water. So have a huge yellow flower that comes out. Similar to the canna lilies people would landscape in Central and North Florida, but they're multicolored. This one's a native that you find around Lake Okeechobee. It's a great wildflower for your wet garden. It's also a host plant for the Brazilian skipper, and this also will get eaten by lubber grasshoppers. Here we have a little wildflower that grows on the edge of the pinelands and prairies. It's called pinklet, Stenandrium dulce. It's in the acanth family. This is another one that you can't really find this at most nurseries. This is basically in people's yards now and brought to these meetings. So this is a great little wildflower. It's a perennial, and it spreads fairly well in the yard, and it'll persist for years and years and years. It's not weedy, though. I know it's a little early for Christmas, but this is a painted leaf, which used to be in the genus Poinsettia. And then the botanists took all the fun out of it, and they put it back in the genus Euphorbia. So this is Euphorbia cyathophora, and it's in the Euphorbiaceae. They'll often have these three-sided capsules, and you'll see these little bits of red on the leaves. A lot of euphorbs have no true petals or sepals. They have flowers in cyathea. And in lieu of that, they have gland appendages on the flowers, and they also have these colored leaves. So what's colorful in the Crispus poinsettia is the leaves. You're not looking at the flowers there. And this one's native.
Is there a non-native one that we see around?
A weedy one? All the three weedy ones are native, even the fiddler spurge. But people do put the Christmas one in their yard sometimes. This is a great tree. This is probably between this, well, and its cousin, the strangler fig, combined, and live oak as far as your best wildlife attractor. This is a short-leaf fig. It's a native ficus, Ficus citrifolia. It's a host plant for the ruddy daggerwing, and figs are unique in that what we think of as fruits are actually ciconia or figs, and the flowers are inside them. And each species of fig has its own species of wasp which pollinates it. And she goes in there and lays her eggs in some of the ovaries of those flowers, parasitizing them, but leaves the others. And she's dusted with pollen and pollinates all those other female flowers that don't get parasitized. And then she dies. Her offspring hatch, the males come out first. And they mate with the females while they're still in the ovaries. And then they drill a hole out and plummet to their death because they have no wings. Then the females emerge. The females emerge, and then the plant figs, the male flowers emerge right as the female wasps come out. So they leave getting dusted with pollen to go find another fig. So what that means is figs have to be figging all the time because wasps only fig, they only live for about a month at most. So that's why this is such a great tree, because it provides food year round for wildlife. And if you ever go with Tropical Audubon and the birders, they know this tree. They know this is where you go to look for birds. And when they're in fruit, it's the hot spot during fall migration. So this is a great tree for your yard if you can fit it in. Unfortunately, these strangler figs and shortleaf figs have a bad rap because they're big trees and they think they're going to destroy your house and the world, etc. But they're the best trees for wildlife. So obviously, I'm not going to cover everything. I will cover this here will be my last plant for tonight. If you have any questions after this, after the talk, you can come to me or Raul. He'll be able to tell you about some of these. So this is a federally endangered plant called Amorpha herbacea variety crenulata. And this is another one that's outside of Everglades National Park. Used to be a lot more of this. And in my lifetime, they've destroyed about 3 or 4 sites, and it's disappeared from one wild population disappeared. So now there's only 2 wild populations left in the world. And but it's in a lot of people's yards. And nurseries used to sell this a lot. I think Fairchild grows it. And now we're growing it on our online store. This is a crenulate lead plant. It's a shrub that gets to be about this tall. It's got real pretty, I mean, it's an attractive landscape plant. It's got real pretty spray of white flowers. And it's in the pea family. And pollinators will come visit it. It is a perennial, but it dies back in the winter and resprouts in the spring. So it's sort of it's more of a temperate species. It's not like a lot of our plants are tropical in origin. This is not. And this is only found in Dade County and nowhere else in the world. So if you have a pine rockland, this is a great addition. It used to grow on the edges of pine rocklands and prairies. It's very pretty. So we got some other great stuff. But tonight, I'll introduce our speaker, Dr. Kenneth J. Feeley, Department of Biology at University of Miami. And his program tonight is Will Rising Temperatures Make Miami Streets Life Even More Exotic? And Dr. Feeley is the Smathers Professor of Tropical Ecology at the UM's Department of Biology. He's also the director of the Gifford Arboretum, the conservation scientist at Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden in Coral Gables. Prior to joining the faculty at UM, Dr. Feeley was a professor at FIU. He conducted postdoctoral research fellowships at Harvard University, Wake Forest University, and received his PhD from Duke University. Dr. Feeley has published more than 170 scientific articles about the effects of climate change and other human disturbances on tropical forests around the world. Dr. Feeley is a Fulbright International Scholar and a National Geographic Explorer. Let's give him a warm welcome.
All right, well, thank you very much, Steve, for the introduction. Are we able to dim the lights a little? Just we can see the slides a little bit. So as Steve said, my name is Ken Feeley. I'm a professor of biology at the University of Miami. I'm also the university's director of the Gifford Arboretum. Now, I know several of you are familiar with the Arboretum and know probably Steve Pearson as the director. So Steve retired about 2 or 3 years ago. We had an interim director for a year, and then I stepped in probably about 2 years ago as the director. So still relatively new there. But it's a wonderful place. And as was announced, we'll be giving a tour of the Arboretum on Sunday morning. So hopefully you can join us there. If you haven't been there before, it's a very nice collection. We have upwards of 400 species there. It's a fairly small Arboretum, but it's pretty dense with different tropical trees. And so we could just spend an hour or so walking around and look at several of the trees that we find interesting, right? And just tell some stories about them. I like to tell the story of the figs, so Steve already stole that from me, but I'll probably tell it again when we're there. So I am a professor of tropical biology, and my research group, I have a team kind of postdocs, graduate students, undergraduates. We focus most of our efforts on tropical forests and on tropical tree species. So most of the time, we're off working in places like this. So this is down in Peru, or this is in Panama. We spend a lot of time in these tropical rainforests, where we're trying to understand the effects of climate change on the tropical forest and on the tree species, the animal species, all the different species that make up these tropical forests. So we also work a lot in the Andes. So we're very interested in the effects of temperature. And so these Andes are this wonderful system for looking at these things. But more and more, we've started to think about the local ecosystems, right? Partly because of COVID, when we got trapped here, but also just as we spend more time and we get to know the systems around us better, we realize that there's a lot to do right here, kind of in our neighborhoods, in our backyards. And so we're increasingly starting to work in some of our natural ecosystems, which include our native habitats. So we're working a lot now in Big Cypress. We have a big project working in the pine forests and the cypress domes of Big Cypress. Also working in some of our parks. So we're kind of not just in the natural habitats, but also in the more urban habitats. So we've started some projects working in parks, also like Matheson Hammock here, or working in kind of urban forests or with street trees, and also in the botanic gardens. So we work a lot in Gifford Arboretum. I also work a lot in Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden, Matheson Hammock, the National Tropical Botanic Garden at Kampong. Probably the only botanic garden where we haven't worked is here at Pinecrest Gardens, but we'd love to do that as well sometime. And as we do this and we start studying these, we're looking at lots of different questions, thinking about what species are where, what these species are doing. But obviously, we're all here in Miami. We know it is hot. And so we are thinking more and more about how changes in climate, changes in temperature may be affecting these ecosystems here in Miami, because it is getting hotter, right? So this is some graphs that a colleague at University of Miami got put together. And what we see is that temperatures are just going up in Miami through time, right? And so if we think about our heat index or absolute temperature, these things are just definitely increasing through time. So it doesn't just feel hotter, it actually is hotter, right? It's a real thing where it is getting hotter and hotter through time. And so even if we just count the number of hot days, right? So this is the number of hours over certain degrees, through time. And so basically, if we think about the number of hours that we spend above 90 degrees Fahrenheit per year, it's about doubled over the last 40 or 50 years, right? And so we're spending a lot more time in the heat. And of course, that makes us uncomfortable, but it's also making the plants uncomfortable, right? These high temperatures, a lot of these plants don't like it, right? And these plants can experience heat stress as well. And so one of the questions we've been trying to study is, how will Miami's kind of these different ecosystems around us here, including our urban tree communities, our street trees, how are they going to be affected by these rising temperatures, right? And so we put together recently, we've kind of developed a research program, and we've conducted a series of studies, and we'll talk about kind of one of these studies right now, where we've tried to address this question, where we've tried to think about, how will Miami street trees be impacted by warming, by rising temperatures? What species are going to thrive in the heat, and what species are going to begin to suffer from the heat? And so, the questions we're looking at is how will the communities be impacted? And, as I said, which species are going to thrive and which ones are going to suffer. But we did think a lot about, well, native versus exotic. So do we expect that there's going to be differences in the sensitivity between our native species and our exotic species to those heat stresses? We do also wanted, obviously, it's not just temperature that we need to worry about, but there are other stressors as well. So briefly, we can think about some other stressors as well, because if we're trying to figure out what trees we should be planting along our streets or in our yards, we can't just worry about the heat. We also need to think about drought or humidity, wind, salt tolerance, these sorts of things, kind of multiple stressors, right? There's a lot of things that make life here in Miami hard. And so we need pretty hardy trees if we want to kind of plant for the future here in Miami. So I know it's hard to read these things or anything, so I'll just kind of describe it and walk through it. But to try to do this study, what we wanted to do is again, just ask, how sensitive or tolerant different species in Miami will be to these rising temperatures. So the first thing we had to do was just figure out what species we have here in Miami. What species are we dealing with? So the first thing we had to do was just assemble a list of the different the common street trees we have around. We did this in a variety of different ways. We used a variety of different sources. So, we kind of scoured the internet and we got all the different planting guides or urban planning guides that all the different municipalities and cities around here were putting out, their lists of recommended and prohibited or species. So kind of get all that different information that the governments were actually putting out. We used lots of different guidebooks, so several of which are in the back there, using some of these guidebooks to look around. And then, of course, also we just use kind of our common knowledge, right? We have a group of us who live around here and think about trees, and so we were able to also just kind of put together our list of species that we know. Overall, what we eventually came up with a list of 234 kind of common street tree species that we have here in the greater Miami area. There's actually many more species than 230 species, but these were ones that we felt were fairly common. We weren't really thinking about the stuff that are in the botanic gardens, the things that are in the arboretums, or the rare ornamentals that maybe some of you have in your gardens and stuff, right? We were interested in kind of thinking about what are the things you see on an everyday basis. I mean, 230 species is still a huge number, much more diverse than you would have in almost any city in the United States, almost any city really in the world. Now, of that list, most of them were exotic. So about 142 of those species are exotic species, and 92 of them were native species. So most of our species actually around here are exotic. We know that obviously lots of the individuals also are exotic, but actually most of the species we have are exotic. And then we classify those into some different life forms. We were just interested. So, most of those species are medium trees, but we also have a large number of large trees, palm trees, large palms, and small palms, right? We were interested in trees. So obviously there are also shrubs and herbs and stuff that we didn't consider there. And I should say, if there's any things that's not clear, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt at any time, right? So we could definitely have time for questions at the end, but I'm happy to go off on tangents or answer any questions if they come up or if something's not clear. And so, as I said, you guys all know what Miami looks like. So you've been around and you've seen our diverse communities. We've seen that we have parts of the city dominated by different species. So we have kind of these mixes of native species like our live oaks, but we also have exotic species like our banyan figs that dominate lots of our streets. We also have other areas that are dominated by palm trees, right, and different types of species. So overall, we have a really high diversity of species, and it's kind of this patchy environment where different areas dominated by different species. So that, we came up with this species list of different species that we know here in Miami. The next thing we wanted to do is try to figure out, well, are they tolerant to the heat or not? Now, we have been doing some studies for, a couple of species. We spend a lot of time. We take their leaves into the lab. We do all sorts of experiments with them. We expose them to different temperatures. We can do all these physiological studies, but there's no way we could do that for, 230, 240 different species. So we had to figure out another way we could basically ask, are these heat tolerant or not? And the way we did that is we basically just looked at where they live and asked, do these species live in hot places or not? And you figure, well, if they live in hot places, they must be able to tolerate the heat. If they don't live in hot places, they must be more sensitive to the heat. Now, the way we ask, right, you guys might not be aware, but there are these incredible databases now where people take all the herbarium records that people have been collecting through time, and they've digitized them, they've scanned them, they've made these images, and they've entered all the data that are on these herbarium sheets here. They've entered all of this into spreadsheets and databases that you can go online. Any of you can do this. You can go in, you can type in the species name, and you can download all this information for any species you want, you know, all these different collections from all around the world. And it's this incredible wealth of data, right? And so, you know, this just zooming in on this one, you know, live oak here on these tags, you know, it gives you, we can look at the sample, we can look at the leaves, you can take measurements of them. So we have some studies where we're doing that. But you also have information about that the collector observations they might have made, but also you have information like where this collection was made, right? So that tells you, you know a location where that species occurred, you know, at that time. And so, for example, you know, you can have this species and you can pull out that location. You could do that over and over again for all the different herbarium records you can find, and you can start to make maps of where these species occur, right? And so if you can see this, right, this is for live oak, that collection, you know, came somewhere up here, but we can kind of make all these different maps or figures showing where different species come from. And so, you know, there are actually more points than this, right? This is hiding some points, but, you know, live oak, a lot of us know it, right, is a southeastern species here. But what we can start to see is that, you know, Florida is about the hottest place where this species occurs, right? So live oak doesn't, you know, there's a few samples in Texas and maybe a few in the Caribbean, but really it's restricted. You know, Miami is about the hottest place where it occurs. And so we have some other species like that as well, like our sable palmetto, right, where Miami is, again, about the hottest place where it occurs. And more, it's what we would call a temperate species. And so we're at that southernmost, hottest point of its range of this temperate native species. You know, a great example of that would be red maple, which we get down here as well, but really it's a northern species. And so red maple, you know, you can guess, doesn't really like it much hotter than Miami because you can never find it any place hotter than Miami. Bald cypress, you know, another basic example of that. Of course, we also have some species, you know, that we can think of being more, that are also native, but are more tropical, right? And so these include things like our West Indian mahogany, our Sweetenia, right? And so it is native, occurs here in Florida, but it occurs in a lot of hotter places as well. It occurs in lots of different Caribbean islands and the West Indies. And so this is a native species that probably does like it a little bit hotter or can tolerate it hotter, right? Because it occurs farther south in some of these hotter locations. Same thing with royal palm. But then we also have, of course, a lot of exotics. And so we start looking at who our exotics are. What we start seeing is that a lot of these exotics, these non-natives, a lot of them, most of them are actually tropical species, right? And so for a lot of these exotics, Miami is actually the coldest place where they occur, right? And so you could say, well, these species really do probably like it a lot hotter, or they could tolerate a lot hotter than Miami. So things like our royal poinciana, right, native to Madagascar, is used to much hotter temperatures than Miami, and Miami is about the coldest place where it occurs. Same thing with our tropical almond or Indian almond, or stuff like our banyan fig, right? These are things where Miami is about the coldest place where you're going to find it. And so we start to see these differences already between these different groups. We kind of have our temperate native species, our tropical native species, and this big group of these tropical exotic species. And so the next thing we could do then basically is for each one of those, we could take those maps and we can try to quantify it. So we could basically create a range or ask, you know, what is that hottest temperature that it could tolerate, right? And so we could do that for each species using those maps. We can figure out the temperature at each location. We pull that out and we ask, what is okay? What's kind of the range of hot temperatures that these species can tolerate? And then we could just simply compare that to what is the temperature we have in Miami now, and what is the temperature, you know, how does it compare also to what the temperature is likely to be in 50 years, 100 years, whatever you want, right? And so we can compare that to different future scenarios and say, when is it going to get too hot for this species? Or is it going to get too hot for this species? And And so when we do that, right, you're not supposed to be able to really see this, but for each one of these, we have 140 species, and we basically have a range of conditions, a range of temperatures over which that species is comfortable. And then, as I said, we can compare that to these different scenarios. And so, for example, if we were to kind of zoom in, these are ordered, we could start to see that we have some species that are really at their hottest limit already, right? And so these include, I've pulled out a few ones, but if we start looking, that includes like our red maple, right? Where it's basically as hot as it's going to be. So this blue line, I just know that's hard to see it, so I don't, but the blue line is kind of our current temperature. Our yellow line is kind of our near future, and the red is a little bit farther into the future scenario. About 2 degrees warming over post-industrial in the yellow, 4 degrees in the red. So we're already at about 1.5, so we're not far from that yellow line actually now. And so we have stuff like our sable palmetto, our bald cypress, our red maple, where they're already at their limit under current temperatures, and they're likely, in those future scenarios, they're already be pushed over their limit. And what we start to see is the ones that are going to get pushed over their limit soonest tend to be those native species, especially those temperate native species, right? And so if we just kind of move down the list, we start seeing, not far down, we get stuff like our live oak, right? And so this is, scares a lot of people because live oak is one of our dominant street trees. It's one of our most commonly planted trees. But really, according to these things, or these predictions, right, it doesn't have too much further to go until it hits its upper heat limit and starts to get heat stressed, right? It might actually already starting to get heat stressed now during any heat waves or hot periods we have. And so I know in lots of different municipalities and areas, people are already debating whether we should be planting live oaks or not, what species we should be planting for lots of different reasons. But, I think we do actually got to start worrying with stuff like the live oak. It's a beautiful tree, but Miami might not be suitable for it anymore, right? And we can already see this in the USDA, right? They have their planting guides, right? We've moved in, we're not in zone 10 anymore. We're in zone 11 and some parts in zone 12, right? And so we're getting outside the comfort zone for some of these species. We also have obviously some of our exotics, those are highlighted in red, are starting to get outside their comfort zone as well. But if we move on farther down the list, what we start to see is more and more of the species that are going to be comfortable, that can tolerate these hotter temperatures, do tend to be mostly our exotic, these tropical exotic species. At the very kind of far end of the list, it's almost exclusively exotics that can tolerate it. A lot of them being our palms, right? A lot of palms are very heat tolerant. And so a lot of our tropical Caribbean palms can tolerate the heat just fine. And this, of course, is another problem because I know a lot of areas are trying to move away from palms and thinking about trying to plant more shade trees. But it looks like actually a lot of the palm trees, our exotic palm trees, might be the ones that are best suited for the future conditions in Miami, right? And so we got to kind of figure out how we can balance all that. If we just try to summarize it, if we put together some of the numbers, basically what we find is that under kind of current conditions, right, all the species can tolerate the temperatures. The natives, the exotics, and that makes sense. They're here already, right? So obviously they can tolerate it. So current, they're all going to be fine, but several of them are near the edge already. But if we move to that kind of near future scenario, we start thinking, we find that about 30% of our native species are going to be uncomfortable and starting to experience heat stress. Whereas only about 10% of our exotic species are going to be heat stressed. So a big difference there, right? We have, in terms of percentage, about 30%, we have fewer natives to start with, and more of them are going to be heat stressed. We move into that slightly farther down, maybe by the end of the century or the later part of the century, and we have 50% of our exotics being heat stressed, still only about a third of our about 50% of our natives being heat stressed, and only about a third of our exotics being heat stressed, right? And so what we're saying is within the coming decades, up to about 50% of our native street trees are probably, this is not going to be the best place for them anymore, right? This is not going to be the Miami that we grew up with, that you grew up with, that these trees grew up with, right? It's no longer be the conditions that they can tolerate. And so we might need to be rethinking what are the species we need to plant. And that might include more of these exotics, or we might need to focus, if we want to really think about the natives, then we really need to be focusing on these tropical natives, right? Mahogany, for example, is perfectly fine. Another way just to quantify this, if we kind of look at kind of how much buffer a species has, so kind of how comfortable it's going to be, kind of its heat tolerance versus its latitude, kind of as predicted, the more tropical things from lower latitudes are going to be more comfortable in the future. Most of those low latitude tropical things tend to be the exotics, where our higher latitude species, our more temperate species, tend to be our natives, and they tend to have kind of that lower buffer. They're going to get more uncomfortable faster than our tropical species. So again, just really trying to stress that as temperatures rise, it's going to have a disproportionate impact on many of our native species, where many of our tropical exotic species might thrive or be comfortable. Now, all that, of course, is bad news for our natives. And you could use that as an argument against planting natives because these are long-lived species, right? These are long-lived trees. But you do have to be thinking decades ahead when we start planting these trees. You can't be thinking, can this tree live now? You need to ask, can it live 50 years from now when you plant it? So it's kind of bad news for our natives. But the little bit of good news we have is that when we do start thinking about some of these other stressors, a lot of our natives do stand out as being really resistant. Right? So several of our native species, especially these ones that can tolerate those high temperatures, a lot of them are just really tough trees in general, a lot tougher than a lot of our exotics. It turns out that a lot of our exotics are, they might be able to tolerate the high temperatures, but they're not able to tolerate the drought. They're not able to tolerate the salt. They're not able to tolerate some of all these other conditions when we do these same sorts of analyses. So we start looking for kind of who are our toughest species, our natives. It comes out with stuff like our mahogany, our lead trees, some of our spiny buceras, or looking at some of our slightly smaller ones, stuff like our gumbo limbos, our Cimaruba glauca, our coca-loba. I mean, these are all things that really are hardy all around. And so, we can start trying to do these, trying to think about which of these species are the most appropriate for the long-term planting and kind of the future Miami, right? Again, we can't be thinking that Miami that you grew up with is the Miami of tomorrow, and definitely, not even the Miami of today is the Miami of the future. So we do have to start thinking in the future. And so, kind of conclusions is just that, just reiterating whatever I said, that in the future, lots of our species, and especially our native species, are going to be heat stressed. Bordering on 50%, half of our species that we're used to common around us today are going to be stressed in the relatively near future by these rising temperatures. And so we need to kind of take that into consideration. We can't just be planting for the conditions we have today. But we also can't just we can't just run towards the exotics because a lot of those are kind of not as hardy on other axes, right? And we need to think about some of those other axes. And so we probably can put together a cohort of hardy native species that will be ones that we can promote for future plantings or that we should consider. Of course, keeping that high diversity is always going to be important. So we can't also just rely on a small number. We also got to think about a very diverse tree community. And so inevitably, some of those are going to come from outside of Miami. It's inevitable that a large number of our street trees are going to continue to be exotics. And so, we might need to expand kind of our thought of what is a native Miami tree, right? We might need to think of ourselves more as part of that greater Caribbean, and be thinking about kind of the Caribbean species as the species we want to promote in the future Miami. So that's all I was hoping to kind of share with you formally, but I'm happy to continue talking, discussing some of these ideas. We also, as I said, this is just a small aspect or a small component of the work we're doing. We do lots of work, lots more technical work and stuff with the Miami trees, with the trees around in Big Cypress, but especially in the tropical areas. And so, but we're always trying to figure out this question of, what is the future going to be for our different ecosystems, different habitats, and different species. So with that, I'll wrap up. And so thank you all very much for inviting me, and thanks for the time here, and happy to continue the conversation. So thank you. Just take the, all right. Yeah.
shape up good.
So slash pine is also, it's another one of these that it's mostly temperate, right? It does have some populations that get, into the Caribbean and stuff. And so it does have some heat tolerance we predict. But it is more actually of a temperate species. Most of the pines are, right? The American pines. There are a whole set of tropical pines, say in Mexico. But most of the American pines are temperate. Obviously, we're in a temperate zone. And so it's one that can also be in trouble. But it also, a lot of it's losing so much habitat anyways, right? It's hard to hold on to those pine rocklands anyways.
But I'm also an environmental gardener. And diversity in my yard, which is 7 acres, I've got host insects that depend on those natives. And so the thinking beyond just the plants is this possible shift of everything down here. Right now, Miami is hugely diverse because it's a mix of temperate tropical species. And the insects, the birds, are on the migratory flyway, all of the animals that depend upon this plant community, with major shifts in plant community, that a lot of the exotics that have been imported here for landscaping were chosen because they don't feed anything. So they look beautiful. They're never chewed up. So, it's hard. And that's just a comment.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And, I think all this, ideally, right, we would just stop this nonsense now and, stop the warming, but that's not going to happen. And so we do need to think about what the consequences are. And it's very hard to find silver linings in these things. The one thing I will point out and is important to think about is that, when we're thinking about the warming and stuff, the urban environment, Miami and stuff, is kind of always a worst case scenario, right? We have this urban heat island effect, so things are going to warm up faster. A lot of these trees are out in the open. And so the effects of high temperatures are going to be felt first by a lot of our street trees. A lot of the native species, even if we're saying they're going to be heat stressed, we're not saying they're going to go extinct or even locally extinct, right? They can probably hang on in some of the cooler, the shadier environments. And so important part for the natives will be to maintain more natural environments that tend to be cooler, right? The more we build up the city, the more we raise the temperature and the more we are going to push some of those native species over the edge. So if we want to preserve those native species, right, it's not going to be as street trees, it's going to be in their native natural communities. And so hopefully that does, if we can do that, right, that allows for some more of the animals, the street trees. I'm sure there will be other things that will come in and eat them, right? I think we're just, Miami is this incredible mix of things from all over the world, some of it intentional, a lot of it not. But, a lot of these things will get eaten, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, we might not like who comes to eat them. But these things do change, and so we've seen that with the banyans, right? Where they didn't used to have their wasp here, and so they weren't able to propagate. But that wasp eventually arrived, and so also a lot of these, the insects that are enemies or friends of these plants may arrive here as things continue to get shuffled around. So it's going to be a different world altogether. Yeah. So. I haven't. I do. You do see trees dying, and so it's one of these things where it's kind of you're never going to see. I don't think we're going to see like a major moment where all the oaks die. You're just going to kind of be a slow thing where some of the oaks are either not doing as well or tend to die more often. A lot of times with heat stress, you don't see things that die. You're not going to know that they're dying of heat stress, right? They might die because of lack of water, or when they get heat stress, they have less resistance to disease. So you're going to find things getting more often, with diseases or blights or higher rates of herbivory. And so it is one of these things where it's very hard to actually know what's going on, but it might be happening right under our nose right now. And so we do need to start keeping good records of this. I don't know what records there are, but people should be thinking about, keeping track and looking at the health of these trees and making sure to keep track of that and see if some of these species are starting to suffer. we have had lots of cases where things get attacked by insects and stuff. And so that could be connected, or things that get, hurt by hurricanes or storms, right? They get weakened. So my guess is we have seen some things, that have been lost or hurt, but we might not recognize what the underlying cause is. Yes. I think that's a great point, right? There is, there may be some species out there that, native species that are out there right now that people hadn't been thinking about or looking at as for these sorts of plantings, but they could be well suited to the future, or they just weren't used for because no one even ever looked at them before. So yeah, I would hope, right? Someone can find some of those species, great. But unfortunately, as we continue to lose a lot of our native populations and native habitats, that's always the problem in all this, is that we're kind of losing the storehouse at the same time that we need to be drawing out of that storehouse. So great if we can do it, and this could be a group that might be able to figure out who some of those species are. But we should always be looking for, we shouldn't always be planting oaks and mahoganies. We should be looking at, more diverse plantings that we can find. Yeah.
So I'm a student at the church house. So last year I worked with the project, and we have more fall tree project where we help the seeds. So my group is all assigned native plants, except for me. And they all come from donations from, like local people who are left. But mine was native Mexico, and it showed up here somehow. So it's not just, it's not just trees. I would say it's like everything is changing here in South Florida. And my project this year, I'm trying to like create not a database, but a way to identify or but I want to use that data to identify how non-native plants are here with the Florida, because there could be a correlation to exactly what you're saying, to change climate change, to but I noticed that a lot of orchids that are South Florida are like from Mexico or from Panama, like but there are more temperate orchids. But also apparently.
No, that's a great point. I mean, obviously, it's not just trees, and so it is everything. And I think it's always interesting. You guys have all probably noticed and been frustrated. Right? Any exotic animal gets a lot of attention, and we hear a lot about it. But there's also a lot of exotic plants, we all know, or invasive plants that are probably doing much more harm than some of the invasive animals, but they don't get the attention, right? There's that whole plant blindness. And so we do have lots of new species coming in that are arriving on their own, or that people are bringing with them. And some of them are getting naturalized and turning invasive. And that's going to be a bigger problem in the future, because the climate is going to be more hospitable for a lot of those things coming in. So it's going to be a growing problem for sure.
One that I know of, its range is within Florida, So there are a lot that are going to be established.
Yeah. I mean, something interesting, one thing people have found, I mean, where orchids, a lot of the epiphytic orchids and other epiphytes, the one advantage they have is they might be able to move around in the tree, right? So people have done studies where they've shown some of these, you know, the air plants and stuff, there are cooler parts of the tree, right? And so there might be these micro habitats or microclimates where they're able to, you know, rather than go extinct or they have to move farther north, they can essentially change where they grow on the tree, higher or lower in the canopy and stuff. So there are some potential escape routes that some of these, you know, things more in the understory or things that are a little less exposed or that can find these microhabitats can take advantage of. And so some of the orchids, you know, can definitely take advantage of that by growing in different parts of the canopy, you know, and finding these more cooler, shadier, more humid parts of the canopy to grow in. But definitely, you know, as things get hotter, it gets harder and harder to find those cooler habitats. Yes, Steve?
Where does the funding for this research come
Well, this sort of, I mean, this specific project was basically unfunded. This was kind of a side project that a bunch of students and I took on. But in general, the research we do, I mean, you know, there's, you know, the university itself provides some funding, but most of it is you guys are paying for it, right? Taxpayers, right? So all the research we do usually gets funded by National Science Foundation, is kind of really the big player in town, right? There are smaller grants and stuff, but it's really all about the National Science Foundation, which is taxpayer funded. The problem there, of course, is that NSF is hurting right now through current administration, especially past administrations, right? The amount of money going towards science has taken a, you know, has not increased at all. And so we've definitely seen decreasing amounts of money for science through time. So less and less money available. Yes.
Have you had observations on black
I haven't. I mean, it might be on the list, but I haven't I looked at it and pulled that out. So.
ask because I have one and it makes so many seedlings, you know, and I think, and then when it flowers, there's so many bees around.
Yeah.
And, but you know, I don't know how, who propagates it or where it would be on a scale, but it's prolific in my yard.
Yeah, so the question was about black ironwood. I mean, and so it's always hard to tell because also with heat stress, another thing is you never know where the filter is. Like, is it going to be these plants that their flowers aren't going to produce pollen, the pollen's not viable. So when you see lots of seedlings, you know, you might take that indication the species is doing as well, and it might be doing well. I'd have to, but it also might be that the filter is later on in life, right? And that it's a later life stage where it really starts to suffer. And so it is always hard to kind of look at a population and get a sense of what's going on because these trees, you know, they're big, they're long-lived, and so it's really hard to kind of get a sense of their overall health. But yeah, I don't know. I'd have to look on there, but
It's a West Indian tree.
yeah. So you know, we definitely, you know, we have some good things. We have some good hardy things. So some of them are going to love it, and they're going to do better in the high temperature.
And do you account for adaptation at all?
So the question is, do we account for adaptation? And the answer is no, right? And so this is a lot of what my research is actually focused on. We're trying to figure out. So most species, if you're thinking about, well, how can they respond to climate change, right? There's really 4 responses. They can move away, right? So species can essentially run away from rising temperatures. They can go higher on the mountain. They go to higher latitude. Or they can stick around and tolerate the conditions, so they can adapt or they can acclimate. And so adaptation is, you know, evolution, and that is usually not a good response for things, especially like trees, because it takes a long time. You need multiple generations. It's not a response of an individual. So these trees, you know, they're going to see within an individual, they're going to see several degrees of warming, and so there's no way they can really adapt. So we generally say for trees, adaptation is not a response. What's potentially a response is acclimation. So acclimation is an individual level response, right? It's you know, when you go to Peru, you go to the Andes, you go to Machu Picchu, you show up there and you have a hard time breathing at first, right? It's hard to get your breath. You're there a couple of days, you acclimate, and suddenly you can tolerate, you know, you can breathe normal again because you've acclimated to it. But your genes haven't changed, so you haven't adapted, you've acclimated. And so the same thing can happen with these trees. We think they probably can acclimate a little, which means they can change their behavior, their physiology, their morphology, so they can tolerate some of that. The last response to that, so if they can't adapt, acclimate, or move, is they go extinct, right? So that's the one we want to avoid. So in this case, acclimation, we don't really count in here. So that might provide a little bit of a buffer. We are doing some other studies where we've been trying to test if species can acclimate. So we focus on just a handful of the more common species. We take stuff in the lab, we put them in different conditions, and we look for that acclimation. And so far, we see that there's hardly any ability of these species really to acclimate, right? Most of them are already kind of maxed out, right? And so there might be a little bit of buffer by acclimation. They might be able to tolerate that hotter temperature, but it's not going to be much, right? So it might get a little better than what I'm saying here, but not much, and not for all species. Yeah.
The thing that's driving this is CO2, and there's another part of the physiology of plants, which is their carbon fixation, whether it's C3 or C4, with the full season C3 species being more rate limited according to CO2 content. So, I think one of the ironies is that higher temperatures are going to make it easier to grow certain temperate crops in places where they're adapted.
Yeah, so the root cause of all this is increasing CO2 and other greenhouse gases. CO2 plants need, right? And so we sometimes say by increasing CO2, we call this carbon fertilization, where it makes it easier for the plants to get the carbon dioxide out of the air to do their photosynthesis. The advantage that gives the plants usually is that they become more drought tolerant, because basically, right, the plants have stomata where they little holes in their leaf on the underside where they're taking up that CO2 to do the CO2, but they also lose water through those same holes, right? Their evapotranspiration. And so if they can get the carbon faster, they can close those holes for more of the day, especially during the hottest parts of the day. And so they'll lose less water. And so plants do generally, because of increasing CO2, they become more drought tolerant. It could allow them a little bit to be more heat tolerant, because they could essentially shut down more in the hottest parts of the day. The problem there is that there is just also an effect of heat on photosynthesis, where photosynthesis becomes less efficient at higher temperatures, right? So most plants, they kind of max out their maximum photosynthesis. Their most efficient photosynthesis is at around 29 degrees Celsius. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but 29 degrees Celsius, but that's leaf temperature also. And so even when it's not that hot in air temperature, a lot of the leaves get that temperature and heat up. So a lot of the plants around here are already, a lot of the day they're spending above that maximum. And so they're actually at suboptimal conditions. And CO2 doesn't really help with that. It could actually make it worse, because they close the stomata and the leaf actually heats up more because they're not transpiring. So there are some advantages to CO2, better for drought tolerance, but it doesn't really help with the heat tolerance. And so you do kind of have these conflicting, right? The CO2 might be a benefit, you could say, but the heat itself is probably is a negative and might overweigh or whatever, be a stronger negative than CO2 is a positive, I'd say. Yeah, in the back.
The question is, you ruled out adaptation because the temperature rises too fast.
Yeah.
Do you have data on how much heat is tolerable? With microclimates, there's sensible, I feel like a chance of that.
Yeah. Well, so we don't have a lot of information on how fast things can adapt, but what I can tell you is we can look back. So 20,000 years ago, right, we were in our ice age, right? The last the glacial maximum was around 20,000 years ago. Then during the glass ice age, we were about 4 degrees colder than we are now. And so over the subsequent 10,000 years, between 20,000 and 10,000 years, the temperature went up by about 4 degrees, right? That's kind of what we're predicting now in 100 years. So it went up 100 times slower in the past. When people look back at how plants and other things responded to that much slower temperature increase, 100 times slower, the things did not adapt, right? So basically the species took that first response of moving. So basically all the species we look at, they moved around, they were able to shift where they occur on the planet, but we can't find any evidence that they actually adapted during that period. So if they couldn't adapt or they didn't adapt when climate change was 100 times slower, it's not going to happen now when it's 100 times faster, right? I'm happy to go. I don't know if they're turning on the lights because they're.
One more question.
All All right. So yes, Ted.
So how would information from studies get to people that might be decisions?
So the question is, how does this information get to the people that make decisions? And the answer is you guys, right? So I don't know who all is in the audience, but hopefully some of you are powerful decision makers. But no, I mean seriously, that is one of the ways where we try to spread the message as best we can, but it's always tough for scientists. We get criticized for not getting the message out, but there's only so much we can do, right? We know how to do the science, we publish it in a paper, and then we essentially hand it to the PR person at the university and hope the message gets out. But that's clearly not sufficient. And so with this, talking to different groups, if you know of other people who need to hear this message, we're happy to hand them a paper or to talk with them or to give another presentation. But I think all of you also have that power. I think you are all the Native Plant Society. You have a voice, and so you can help spread that message, and just that we need to be more informed and thinking and not just blindly planting what needs to be out there. Whether it's exotic or native, we just need to think about what species belong in what places.
Thank you. All right, we'll do the raffle next. You can buy raffle tickets from